morning, everyone. How's everybody doing? We certainly appreciate the folks in Fayetteville for agreeing to host this, our third symposium on the War of 1812. We decided that we would come to Fayetteville last year after we had such a great turnout and such great support behind the Camp Blunt program and the Camp Blunt preservation efforts, which you'll hear more about later this afternoon. Before we get too far into this, I would like to go ahead and do a commercial. We'll get the commercial out of the way first. I will tell you it's probably not the last commercial you'll hear today, but certainly the first, and that is if you have seen the War of 1812 Bicentennial Commission lapel pins, they are for sale in the lobby, as well as Christmas ornaments that commemorate Camp Blunt. The proceeds from this go to assist the efforts to interpret the Camp Blunt site. So please consider purchasing one of these before you leave, or the Christmas ornaments. The first person we're going to introduce this morning, and if you haven't done the math yet, when we get to September of this year, it will be the 200th anniversary of the writing of the lyrics that would eventually become the national anthem. And as Dr. West and I and most of the people in this room will agree, all things connect back to Tennessee, and Francis Scott Key even has a connection to Tennessee and with Andrew Jackson's administration. So we want to make sure we commemorate the national anthem in a proper way, and here to sing the national anthem for us this morning is Victoria Matheny. Please welcome her.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hail at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
All of our symposiums, and we have to talk a little bit about the way the War of 1812 Bicentennial Commission is organized. We were created officially by the state legislature, but in things so typical, they created this commission and then did not fund it. So what we all do is we have agencies across the state, both private, nonprofits, official state entities, and we all kind of agreed to work together to try to commemorate the War of 1812 in some meaningful way. And there's been many ways that we have done that, through traveling exhibitions, through living history programs, through preservation efforts. But undoubtedly, the thing that has been the most consistent, and the things that we have done throughout the state, beginning in March of 2012, is to hold these series of symposiums, which have been funded by the Center for Historic Preservation at Middle Tennessee State University. Leading that effort is the head of the Center for Historic Preservation at MTSU, which is Dr. Carol Van West, but he also now serves as our state historian. So if you would, welcome Dr. Van West to the podium.
Well, good morning, everyone. How are y'all? It's a little bit humbling to come up and speak to you after that beautiful rendition of the national anthem. Let's give Victoria another round of applause for that. If that doesn't get you going this morning, go and drink some more coffee. Obviously, you need it. And before I make sort of my opening remarks to kick the symposium off, I do want to particularly thank everyone here in Fayetteville and the Lincoln County High School for providing us with this great venue. They were here this morning. I got here at 8 o'clock as I threatened Dr. Beasley that I would, and they were already here, doors open, tables being set up, so we could get everything ready for this morning's symposium. So that was very gracious and very much appreciated by what the Lincoln County High School has done for us in this symposium. It sort of fits into a theme that some of you have heard me talk about probably too many times, but I always think it's worth repeating. We didn't get the name the volunteer state by accident. Tennesseans always amaze me, and we tend to amaze other states as well. Much like the Civil War Sesquicentennial Commission, which does get generous funding from the General Assembly, $157,000 a year, compared to Virginia's $5 million. But then everyone's telling me now, well, Tennessee's got the best Civil War sesquicentennial of anyone. There's no comparison. How did that happen? Well, we worked together. And then they were like, yeah, but how did that happen? We work together. And certainly that's more than true for the War of 1812 Bicentennial Commission. There was a group of us, and I really do want to acknowledge the leadership of Myers Brown with the Tennessee State Library and Archives. He's the one who just wouldn't let this go away and kept on badgering on me and several other folks that we need to pull something together. Let's get something going on this. Because like me, Myers says, we can talk about the Civil War till sometime next week before we would get tired of it. But we also knew this conflict and this time period in Tennessee history was really when the state took the international stage. It's a very important time. It had been largely forgotten 50 years ago at the 150th, and there were a group of us determined not to let that happen. So I want to sort of call out the role of the ones who have been there from the beginning. Now, you guys have been part of this. Showman right here in Fayetteville, I don't know, Showman, you first emailed me in like 2010, something like that. Hey, we've got Camp Blunt down here. Let's get something going on this. And then Dr. Ferris Beasley joined into the fray. And what y'all have done here is truly remarkable. It's one of the most important events of the whole bicentennial, this creation of a Camp Blunt historic site. But then you have the Tennessee State Museum, the Tennessee Historical Society, and then today you get to hear from two of the really important agencies, or three of the important agencies that have helped us. The Tennessee Wars Commission and Fred Prouty. Fred, of course, really worked with the community on the Camp Blunt site and deserves all the applause. We'll give him a little bit later this morning. But then also Ben Nance from the Tennessee Division of Archaeology. They have been at the forefront of this from the get-go. And then you have Tom Cannon from the Tennessee State Library and Archives. I will always remember fondly a long car drive that Tom and I took as we went into Jackson County to look at an old Tennessee Century farm. Oh man, this was 06, 05, something around there, a while back. And he talked about this book that he was working on Tennessee in the War of 1812. Well, the book's not going to be out till this summer, but I was lucky enough to be given an advance to copy, to read, and to comment on. And it's finally the comprehensive study of Tennessee in the War of 1812 that we've needed forever. So, you know, the commitment of these agencies is what brings the Center for Historic Preservation to the table. I mean, we love to work with communities. I mean, one of our first projects was down here in Fayetteville with the old Borden milk plant and saving that building back in the 1980s. So it's good to come back here today and see where the community is, still has that great historic district of beautiful homes as you come into the town here from the north. You know, your square is so vibrant, so much going on, always there. Then, you know, in last decade, I worked with African American community to put 2 of those historic black churches just south of or I guess it's west of the square on the National Register. You guys have really touched all the bases in bringing out your history and heritage. So for all of those reasons, it's very appropriate that we have gathered to get here today in Fayetteville at Lincoln County High School to commemorate the War of 1812 and what it means. Now, if you haven't picked up a program, be sure you get one of these sometime today. They're out there on the table next to the War of 1812 driving tour. If you don't have one of those, be sure you get that, because not only is Camp Blunt there, but many other properties across the state. This is, again, something that Tennesseans don't realize. This war touched almost every corner of the state. West Tennessee, of course, gets created as part of the legacy of the war. So it's had a tremendous influence on the state, and that brochure helps to convey that not only to residents of Tennessee, but also to tourists of Tennessee. And I guess that gets me into my formal remarks, the forgotten war that defined a region and reshaped the nation. Now, I know as the state historian, I'm supposed to always grab the bully pulpit and talk about why Tennessee is important and exceptional, but it's sort of hard not to with the War of 1812. I mean, we were on part of the frontier of that war. And when a lot of people talk about the War of 1812, they think of the Great Lakes, they think of New York State, and of course Canada. Where in Canada, this is a major event, the bicentennial of the War of 1812. Maybe not so much down here in the United States, but certainly in Tennessee, it did start to reshape first the state. Without Jackson's victory in the campaigns that our scholars are going to discuss in just a moment, what is the course of history with West Tennessee? Certainly, settlement would have continued to move west, but you know, by the end of the decade of the War of 1812, Memphis had been founded, and the outlines of the state that we know today were largely in place. And then, how did it reshape the nation? Well, by pushing settlement to the west. Alabama was not a state at the time of the War of 1812. Mississippi was not a state at the time of the War of 1812. This conflict opened up settlement. It changed Native American history. It's in some ways the beginning of the Trail of Tears. The Indians that did remain here would be pushed out into Oklahoma within 20 years of the end of the war. So it's the beginning of a process that really defined the United States as we know it today. And I particularly want to bring you back to Victoria's opening national anthem. It started to form our nation. Yeah, I know the national anthem wasn't designated until much later, but it was a song and a poem that caught people's imaginations and certainly launched the career of Andrew Jackson, the first president of the United States that was sort of a break from the founding fathers and pointed the nation into a new direction. So there's many ways that we can look back to this period and say the modern United States begins at the time of this conflict. And I think it's also important for you to remember that when this war was fought, there were still doubters in other European countries. Would this great, grand experiment of the United States of America really make it? When the war began, the country was only a little over 20 years old. And so many people thought this idea of a democratic nation, it was doomed to failure. No republic like this would ever really make it. And there was a lot of thought, particularly on the British side, this was a war easily won, and we can sort of get back some of the stuff we lost by the previous generation. So the men who gathered here in Fayetteville, God, are they famous names. From the Cherokees who fought in the campaigns to the south, to such iconic names in American history as Crockett, Houston, Jackson, and then others who I think should be just as well known, particularly William Carroll. So a lot started here in Fayetteville, and I think I want to thank everyone for gathering this morning on what looks like is going to be a beautiful spring day during the NCAA basketball tournament to talk about the War of 1812 and its consequences. So thank you for being here today. Now, let me start the festivities full on with our first speaker of the morning. And this is Dr. Mark Cheatham from Cumberland University. Now, I've known Mark for a long time. He's one of these guys who gets involved with the Tennessee Encyclopedia Project back in the last century. It's hard to believe that project is that old now, but it is. And Mark has finished his PhD at Mississippi State University. I thought about bringing a cowbell to bring everyone to attention, but decided to pass on that. You know, thought Mark maybe had heard enough of those in the past. But I was so glad that after he had taken some different positions at history departments in other parts of the country, that somehow we got him back into Tennessee, because his work has been top-notch for many years, and he is the author of a really important biography of Andrew Jackson Southerner, that the Louisiana State University Press has just published. And he does have copies of this book with him today if you want to pick up one. And I do urge you to do so, because sometimes we do want to look at Jackson as the national hero, largely because of what happened during the War of 1812 and his presidency. But Jackson was always a Southerner. And I think Dr. Cheatham's new book really helps to hammer home that point. So we're lucky to convince him to come down here from Lebanon this morning, from the beautiful campus of Cumberland University. And Dr. Cheatham is here to speak on Old Hickory, Horseshoe Bend, and the Treaty of Fort Jackson, Causes and Consequences. I present you Dr. Mark Cheatham.
Thank you, Van. I appreciate that introduction. I may have to take you on the road with me so I don't have to sell my own books. I'll just have you do it for me. Myers, would you mind?
They've locked you out.
They've locked me out. Well, that happens occasionally. As long as it's not my wife doing it, I'm okay with that. I'm thrilled to be here. I appreciate, as I said, Van's introduction. I appreciate Myers contacting me and asking me to be here, and it's good to see old friends. Tom Cannon and I have known each other for a few years, and Kelly Wilkerson and just a number of other people. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. In December of last year, I went to my campus mailbox and I had a letter, and it was a handwritten letter. And for those of you who are older, you realize this is a disappearing art form. So I was really excited, and I didn't know who it was from. I recognized it wasn't from my parents or my aunt or someone who would normally write me a handwritten letter. So in any case, I opened the letter, and it was from a gentleman I'd never met before. And he started the letter by saying, "I've just read your new biography of Andrew Jackson, and I want you to know that Andrew Jackson was one mean SOB." Well, I knew it wasn't a fan letter at that point. And he actually went on to talk about how his great-great-grandmother had been part of the Trail of Tears, and he was very upset with Jackson for that, and he explained some of the circumstances. And then he concluded the letter by comparing Jackson to George Armstrong Custer, whom I assumed he did not think much of either. In any case, that letter brought home to me the reality that this man, Jackson, and the decisions that he made still affected people today. The gentleman who wrote me the letter was in his late 80s, and this was something that was very important to him, and he felt compelled to write me and let me know that this was important to him. So what I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to talk about Jackson. This is going to be very Jackson-centric. And we're going to talk about how Jackson got to the point of fighting the Creek War during the War of 1812. I'll talk a little bit about the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. I'm not a military historian, so I'll just be upfront about that. But I do want to talk a little bit about that. But then I want to talk about the consequences. And what I hope you'll walk away from the talk today with is a sense of who Jackson was, why he came to believe what he did about Native Americans, and then what the consequences were for both Native Americans and, of course, for the nation. So I want to begin actually in the Waxhaws, which is where Jackson was born, and where I spent spring break having to answer the question, in which state was Jackson born? Was it North or South Carolina? Those people there really care about that question. And so I answered it the best I could. Jackson said he was born in South Carolina, and then I was quiet, which was probably a good idea. In any case, Jackson grew up in the Waxhaws district along the North Carolina-South Carolina border. This was an area that prior to his birth had been racked by violence between whites and Native Americans in the area. By the time Jackson was born in 1767, that violence had for the most part petered out and did not flare up during Jackson's early years there until he left as a teenager. And so I mention this because one of the misconceptions I think about Jackson is that he was always an Indian fighter. And in fact, if you go back and you read the great biographers like Robert Remini and James Parton and Marcus James and others, when they talk about Jackson, the sense you get from them is that Jackson always hated Indians. He always fought Indians. At every opportunity, he would find an Indian and kill that Indian. And that, I think, does an injustice to Jackson. And so I want to try to explain and deconstruct some of that mythology about him. So as Jackson's growing up, even though he's not fighting Indians, certainly his neighbors, his relatives would have talked about the conflict that had taken place in the prior years before, and maybe even during Jackson's early years of life. This was something that I think did affect Jackson. And I think it affected him in the sense that it created within him this fear of Native Americans, I don't think I would call it hatred at this point, but it's certainly this fear and an understanding that whites and Native Americans did not get along. One of his relatives, or supposed relatives, it's not really clear if she's even a relative, in later years remembered, according to her memory, that Jackson and his mother were inveterate haters of the Indians on account of their barbarities. And she actually said that one of Jackson's brothers was killed by Native Americans in the area of the Waxhaws, which certainly was not true. He had two older brothers, one of whom was killed during a battle, the other of whom died of smallpox. So, and in fact, I think that this relative has had a large effect on the way that early historians and biographers thought about Jackson and the Indians, and I think that has been perpetuated in other biographies. But any sense, even though Jackson doesn't fight Indians in the Waxhaws, he's aware of their place and certainly aware of the violence. Once Jackson moves to the Middle Tennessee area, he also becomes aware of the fact, very aware of the fact, that Native Americans and whites do not get along. And this map shows you some of the settlements that were in Middle Tennessee in the early 1780s prior to Jackson arriving. Many of them still existed when he arrived in 1788. Some did not, however, and the reason they did not exist was because they had been wiped out by Native Americans. During Jackson's early years in Middle Tennessee, the evidence for him engaging in any kind of violence or any kind of military engagement with Native Americans is either non-existent, is something that was remembered after his death, and so is, I think, questionable because people were reading back several decades prior, knowing Jackson's reputation, knowing that he becomes president and all those things, and perhaps that skews their memory of him. There are a couple of accounts of Jackson engaging in military campaigns or being part of a group that was attacked by Native Americans, but I've not found any evidence that he actually is at the head of a campaign to wipe out Indians, or in fact that he even kills any Native Americans during his early years in Middle Tennessee. And so you may be thinking, well, why does any of this matter? Well, I think it matters because understanding Jackson means understanding who he was, understanding the reality of who he was. And what that means is that prior to the War of 1812, Jackson is not an Indian fighter. That reputation largely comes from the War of 1812 and is something that is really consistent throughout the rest of his life. Having said that, that does not mean that Jackson was not like many white Southerners in Middle Tennessee and in other parts of the South who feared Native Americans and who understood this conflict. And in fact, as Jackson was looking ahead to the potential conflict with Great Britain, the inevitable war, it seemed, in early 1812, he talks about the danger that Middle Tennessee and that the United States faced. And that danger was something that I think many people were aware of. So Tom Cannon, who's going to speak later, has explored in depth an attack that was made on a white family near the Duck River in Humphreys County. And that event really shocked Middle Tennessee society and made many people fearful that this pan-Indian confederacy that Tecumseh was trying to formulate was starting to come together. And Jackson was one of those people who was afraid of that. And so in early 1812, Jackson talks about the danger that was present in Middle Tennessee. And so this is what Jackson says. And he's talking about Tecumseh. That incendiary, the emissary of the prophet was Tecumseh's brother who was part of the effort to pull Native Americans together. That incendiary, the emissary of the prophet, who is himself the tool of England, has caused our frontier to be stained with blood and our peaceful citizens to fly in terror from their once happy homes. Jackson argued, and he was making this argument to Governor Blunt, Jackson argued that this attack on the Duck River was an opportunity not only to exact revenge for previous attacks and for that attack, but it was also an opportunity to weaken the Indian presence on the southern frontier. And so he goes on to write Governor Blunt, "The sooner we strike, the less resistance we shall have to overcome, and the terrible vengeance inflicted at once upon one tribe may have its effect upon all others." One of the things to understand about Jackson during the War of 1812 and thereafter is that he often couches his prosecution of military campaigns against Native Americans within the context of national security. And I think he truly believes that on some level. And it makes sense because Middle Tennessee and Tennessee in general were still part of that frontier. They were still Native American settled. within the borders and along the borders. And so this is a very real threat, and Jackson and many other people perceive that. So Governor Blunt, Jackson writes to Governor Blunt, tells him we must do something about this. Governor Blunt doesn't immediately respond, and in fact, the James Madison administration was attempting to negotiate for the release of some of the people who had been captured or kidnapped during that Duck River attack. And so Jackson writes Governor Blunt again, and he says this: when we judge to ourselves our beloved wives and little prattling infants, butchered, mangled, murdered, and torn to pieces by savage bloodhounds and wallowing in their gore, you can judge our feelings. And so again, Jackson is reiterating this sense that I think Blunt was very well aware of, that this was a threat that had to be dealt with. Well, in June of 1812, of course, the United States Congress declares war on Great Britain and on its allies, which would have been many of the southern Indian tribes. One of the interesting things about the War of 1812 and Jackson is that many people talk a lot about Jackson's hatred of the British, that really motivates him during the war. And I have problems with that I won't get into right now. If you read his letters and his speeches, however, Jackson early in the war doesn't seem that concerned about the British. He's concerned about Native Americans. He's concerned about defending the frontier. So for example, in July of 1812, as Jackson's calling together volunteers to help him move south and to begin a military campaign, this is what he tells the volunteers: turn your eyes to the south. Behold, in the province of West Florida, a territory whose rivers and harbors are indispensable to the prosperity of the western and still more so the eastern division of our state. While the American army shall sheathe its sword, the tomahawk and the scalping knife will redouble their activity and mingle together the blood of gray-headed age, of the tender mother, and of the infant babe. So his argument to these volunteers is that if we look southward, if we look all the way down into Spanish Florida, what we see are Native Americans who are ready to strike. And if we keep our sword in its sheath, then we are going to find ourselves on the end of the tomahawk. And so we have to do something about this. Well, Jackson takes these volunteers on a failed campaign in 1812 and a failed campaign south. He's forced to bring them back to Nashville, to bring them back to Tennessee. And he's very angry about that. And on the way back is actually when he takes on this nickname Old Hickory that's so familiar. Before he marches his men back to Tennessee, Jackson talks to them about the journey they're going to face. And in doing so, he once again emphasizes the Native American threat. We have to pass a savage country, he said, one inhabited by natives who are committing unheard of brutality and murder of our brethren. Still, it becomes us until we are ordered by the government to withhold our hands from the vengeance, lest we strike the innocent and bring disgrace and guilt upon our heads. That's a very interesting statement by Jackson. And what it says is that even though Jackson wanted to prosecute this war against natives, even though he wanted to, bring about national security and even gain revenge, he's still very much aware that he has to be careful about what the national government wants to take place, right? And the image that I have of Jackson is sort of this image of restrained rage, this image of restrained energy, that he is just vibrating with the desire to take on these Native Americans, yet he has to restrain himself and his men because that is not what he's called to do at that particular moment. Of course, in 1813, Jackson will get that opportunity. 1813 inaugurates the Creek War, which is the major part of Jackson's contribution to the War of 1812. And I say that recognizing the Battle of New Orleans is extremely important. That date of January 8th, which also happens to be my wife's birthday, and so I never forget, as someone pointed out yesterday, I never forget the Battle of New Orleans. I originally said I never forget my wife's birthday because it's on January 8th, and someone said, maybe you need to flip that around to make your wife feel better. And I thought, that's a good point. So in any case, I recognize that the Battle of New Orleans is extremely important. But at the same time, if we look at what Jackson does during the War of 1812, he spends most of his time fighting Indians, and doing so very successfully. And as you see on the map, Jackson and his men begin in Fayetteville, and they essentially march southward through the middle part or the central part of Alabama. And they do so in response to attacks, once again, by Native Americans. And so national security, vengeance, both of these things are part of Jackson's and his men's motivation for doing this. Their focus in Alabama, of course, will be the Red Stick Creek, who were the faction of Creek Indians who were engaged in warfare with the United States and who were allied with Great Britain. The central event that brings about the Jackson campaign, or the start of the Creek War in 1813, is the attack on Fort Mims in Alabama. It was an attack by Native Americans on a white settlement, which resulted in a number of dead white civilians. And it wasn't just the fact that they were killed by the Red Stick Creek, but it was the manner in which they were killed. So, for example, there were reports that came back to Nashville of civilians being burned alive, pregnant women being cut open, children's heads being smashed against the fort's walls. All these things were intended to galvanize support for this campaign. And in fact, those rumors were not just rumors, they were true. And so it wasn't just rhetoric, it was something that was important. So Jackson and his men of 5,000 troops begin their campaign in October of 1813 in Fayetteville. They march south in a number of battles that will eventually bring them to the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. This is a more modern picture of Horseshoe Bend, which gives you a sense of what it looked like in reality. And then this is a map that shows you the campaign that took place in March of 1814. This campaign is a campaign or a battle that will begin on March 27th, will essentially be over that day. There will be a little bit of carryover into the following day, but most of the activity takes place on March 27th. This engagement will result in Jackson's men, his force of about 5,000 soldiers, overwhelming approximately 1,000 male soldiers. Jackson reported to his wife Rachel. The fighting continued with some severity for 5 hours. The carnage was dreadful. It was dark before we finished killing them. Approximately 850 Creek warriors were killed as a result of this battle. Jackson and his Indian allies, the dead among them numbered around 45 men. There seems to be some differences in the reporting that took place. This defeat at Horseshoe Bend was an important part of the Creek War and the Creek Campaign. It essentially broke the Red Stick resistance in Alabama. Many of the Red Stick Creek found themselves going southward to Spanish Florida, allying themselves with the group called the Seminole, and Jackson was not done with the Creek. He will later, after the War of 1812, will make his way into Spanish Florida, probably illegally, although he doesn't believe so, and will try to finish off what he began during the War of 1812. The Battle of Horseshoe Bend will bring Jackson promotion. He will earn appointment as a major general. He will be put in charge of the 7th Military District, which included Tennessee, the Mississippi Territory, which was Alabama and Mississippi. Jackson, as I said, was not done with the Creek, and he was not done with the Creek even at that point. Jackson was so angry with how the Red Stick Creek had treated white civilians. He was so angry about the Fort Mims massacre. He was so angry about, in general, just about the way that Native Americans were allying with the British, that he wanted to punish the Creek even more. And what's interesting is that when you look at the Treaty of Fort Jackson that was signed following the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, and the Treaty of Fort Jackson is indicated in the red. It's the part of central Alabama and then the jog over into southern Georgia. When you look at Jackson's approach to the Treaty of Fort Jackson, he doesn't just want to punish the Red Sticks. He wants to punish all Creek Indians. And this is one of the interesting things about Jackson, and we were talking beforehand about this. Jackson does reward his Indian allies. There are lots of examples of that, and I heard some right before we began about some others I didn't even know about. But Jackson also has a tendency to sort of put all Indians into one category. And that's something that I have to talk to my students about. We use these general terms, Indians and whites and Southerners and all that. And we have to understand that, we have to break those down at times and understand that there are different viewpoints and different ways of looking at groups within those general signifiers. So in any case, Jackson tends to at times generalize. And so with the Treaty of Fort Jackson, he wants to punish the Creek. He wants to punish even those men who had been allied with him, the White Stick Creeks. And so this is what he tells the Creek representatives at the treaty negotiations. You have followed the counsel of bad men and made war on a part of your own nation and the United States. This war has cost the United States a large sum. You must yield as much of your land as will pay this sum, but it must be taken from your whole nation in such a manner as to destroy the communication with our enemies everywhere. And what's interesting about this is that Jackson indicates that he understands this is punishing his own allies, but he sees it as something that's necessary in order to break the will of the Creek Nation. When the Creek chiefs protested, Jackson reiterated his point, and he said this: "We will destroy our enemies because we love our friends and ourselves. The safety of the United States and your nation requires that enemies must be separated from friends." And so when this treaty was signed in August of 1814, giving up nearly 23 million acres of land, it was a treaty that punished both friend and foe alike. But Jackson, again, thought it was necessary to break down the Creek resistance and to break down, in general, the Southern Indian resistance against the United States. So, as I said, Jackson's actions toward Native Americans during this period are very contradictory. And that is one of the interesting things about Jackson. One of the reasons I even became interested in studying Jackson when I worked at the Hermitage in the summer of 1995 was because of his complexity. He is not an easy person to explain. He's not an easy person to understand. And I know that a lot of people simplify him and they're able to see him in black and white terms. I can't see him that way. I see him as a very complex man, and this Indian issue is one that is very complex. So what's the complexity? Well, on the one hand, he treats friend and foe alike, even though friendly Indians had helped him defeat these Red Sticks. He endorses the slaughter of Indians in the name of national security. At the same time, he also sends 3 Creek Indian boys back to the Hermitage, to Rachel, to be raised. And as I've given talks about Jackson and about my new book over the past several months, this is a point that has been consistently raised in almost every talk during the Q&A. What about Lincoln? What about the Indian boy? Okay? Well, the first thing to understand is that there are 3. There's Charlie, there's Theodore, and then there's Lincoln. Charlie and Theodore were sent back to the Hermitage. They apparently died in infancy. There are very few references to them, and those references disappear very quickly. So the assumption by the Hermitage and by me is that they must have died. Lincoln, however, is a young Creek boy who's sent back to the Hermitage who lives. And he lives actually until 1828. He dies during that election year. And Jackson, who does not formally adopt him, right? And that's one of the other misconceptions, that Jackson adopts him and brings him into his family. He doesn't. Jackson brings Lincoln, or sends Lincoln to the Hermitage to be raised. He is raised there. Jackson actually tries to get Lincoln an appointment to the United States Military Academy, which doesn't work out because John Quincy Adams is the president, and so that's sort of a major obstacle. Then Jackson helps Lincoln get a job in Nashville as a saddlemaker's apprentice, and it is during that period that Lincoln dies. So how do we explain that? How do we explain Jackson, whose men are slaughtering these Indians, and then he takes one of the infant boys from the battlefield and sends it back to Rachel and sends 2 others back to Rachel to be raised? How do we deal with that? Well, I don't have a good answer, and my students hate it when I say that. They want the black and white answer. What do I need to know for the test? which answer should I give? There's not really an easy answer, and so let me just sort of give my sense of what may have been going through Jackson's mind. Jackson wrote Rachel, his wife, a letter after he sends Lincoln to the hermitage. And this is what Jackson says, and this is the only evidence that we have from Jackson that addresses this issue. This is what he writes Rachel. When I reflect that he, Lincoln, as to his relations is so much like myself, I feel an unusual sympathy for him. It's a very short sentence, but it's really loaded. Jackson has this sympathy for Lincoln because Lincoln was an orphan. Just like Jackson had been an orphan. His father had died around the time he was born. His mother died during the Revolutionary War. His two brothers died during the war. By the time he was a young adolescent, Jackson had no immediate family. So Jackson has this, not just a sympathy, but an empathy for Lincoln. But the irony is that the reason he's even able to have that is because Jackson's men had made Lincoln an orphan. And Lincoln had become an orphan at Jackson's orders. So it's hard to wrestle with that. And so I mentioned this to the teachers' workshop yesterday, and I've mentioned this in other talks. As humans, we tend to sometimes hold two different ideas in our mind that are contradictory. And I think you can see that with Jackson in this particular case. On the one hand, he wants to wipe out the Creek resistance. He wants to eliminate them. On the other hand, he is able to send Creek boys back to the hermitage to be raised, to basically preserve their lives. Right? Those two things are very contradictory, yet Jackson holds them at the same time. And as humans, that is one of the things that we do. I don't know if it's a curse or a skill or what, but we're able to do that at times. And I think it's important to recognize that with people in the past, that they do things oftentimes that don't make sense, that are contradictory, and that is what, in part, what makes them human. In any case, after the war, Jackson spent the next several years attempting to, as he put it, civilize the Indians. And so basically what civilizing the Indians meant was taking their land, convincing them by treaty, by coercion, by bribery, by some mixture of those attempts, convincing them to leave, to give up their land, and in an interesting foreshadowing of what was to come, sometimes even to exchange their land in the South for land west of the Mississippi River. In one of the letters that he wrote to an Indian tribe he was negotiating with, Jackson said this, and this really, again, reiterates that theme that you find in his correspondence. Friends and brothers, justice will be done by the President of the United States to all his red children. He will protect his friends and punish his enemies. A consistent theme throughout Jackson's correspondence from the War of 1812 through his presidency. Presenting the government, which when he's president represents himself, presenting the government as sort of the fatherly figure, speaking about the Indians as children, and using this paternalistic language that really the only motivation that the government has is to take care of Indians, to treat them like children and to protect them while punishing those who are causing trouble. During the course of Jackson's post-war career until the early 1820s, he oversaw treaty negotiations with the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, and the Choctaw. Those treaties resulted in millions of acres being added to the United States in the present-day states of Alabama, Georgia, Kentucky, Mississippi, Missouri, and Tennessee. These decisions, these treaties that Jackson makes, are extremely important in helping to create the United States. Extremely important, and I'll reiterate that point here in just a minute as I wrap up. Of course, what Jackson is most known for when it comes to Native Americans is his actions as president. In fact, again, in giving talks across the Southeast, one of the questions that comes up is, what do you think about Jackson and the Trail of Tears? Well, the first thing to say about that is that Jackson he did not oversee the Trail of Tears. That was actually Martin Van Buren in 1838. However, Jackson certainly helps to set up the Trail of Tears. He makes decisions in concert with Democrats in Congress to ensure that that activity can take place. Jackson as president really follows the precedent of the previous 6 administrations. He does what the Virginia presidents, to a great extent, and the Adamses, to a lesser extent, had done. He attempts to civilize Indians, oftentimes by removing them from their land, all in the name of protecting Indians and preserving national security. So in that sense, Jackson is really not that different from the other previous administrations that preceded him. However, one of the things that is different about Jackson is that he is much more aggressive. And that, I think, comes from his experience during the War of 1812 and his interaction with Native Americans and his understanding of them. According to one estimate, approximately 90,000 Native Americans were displaced beginning in 1830 with the Indian Removal Act, ending in 1843 with the end of the Second Seminole War. So even though Jackson is not president throughout all those 13 years, his policies set these actions into motion. So 90,000 Native Americans displaced from the east to the west. Again, millions of acres taken over by the United States as a result of that. So, what does all this mean for us today? What does Jackson's actions towards Native Americans mean for us today? Well, certainly for the man who wrote me in December, this has a very real effect on him and his family. It's affected him enough that he feels very strongly about it. For us as a nation, Jackson's actions during the War of 1812 begin the antebellum South that we think of. If you look at the area that is taken over by the United States due to removal during the War of 1812, and then, of course, later during Jackson's presidency, that area is the area that creates the Deep South. That is the area that becomes the basis of the cotton or the cash crop agriculture, mostly cotton, the cash crop agricultural system that relies on slave labor. And so while Jackson is not solely responsible for that, and understand me clearly, I'm not saying he's the only person responsible, his actions via warfare and via treaty negotiation are essential to creating this land vacuum that white Americans fill with their own settlement and with their slaves. And in doing so, Jackson creates this antebellum South that we think of. And this is one of the things that I think we have missed about Jackson's contribution, for good or for ill, that we've missed about his contribution in regards to Indian removal. That he has created the South, the antebellum South, the Deep South, that is so crucial to, of course, producing the Civil War later. And again, one of the ironies about Jackson's life is that he helps to create this antebellum South. And then in 1832-33, he also presents the solution, which is to stand up against nullification, which brings in this nationalism and this nationalistic identity that he has. In any case, what's important about Jackson and Indian removal, and again, I hope that you've learned something new. What's important about it is to understand Jackson doesn't begin his life as an Indian fighter. That is something that comes much later. But his early life certainly influences his attitude toward Native Americans. He is very typical of white Southerners in terms of how he thinks about Native Americans. When he has the opportunity during the War of 1812 to act on those prejudices, which were common at the time, he does so, and he does so for national security reasons for the most part. I should point out that Jackson also benefits financially from Indian removal. So during the 18 teens, for example, as Indians are being removed from Alabama and then eventually from Florida, one of the things that's clear in Jackson's private correspondence is that he sees this as an opportunity for himself and for other people to make money. So he writes people about Huntsville, Alabama, newly opened up land. This is land where you can get, an acre for $1. You should take advantage of this. In Pensacola, you can make a lot of money in land speculation there. And that is something that Jackson does to an extent, and he certainly encourages other people to do. And again, this is sort of the complexity of Jackson. He's not just motivated by national security. He's not just motivated by the prejudices of the time, but he's also motivated by his own financial benefit and the benefit of others. And so, understanding Jackson during the War of 1812, again, it's national security, private interests, it's the prejudices. Haven't talked a lot about the effect that this has had on Native Americans, but certainly within the Native American community, this has been an important piece of history, and I think probably Native Americans have been more in tune with remembering this period than Americans have. When I was in the Waxhaws last week, I was giving a talk at the Andrew Jackson State Park, and I actually had two protesters, the first time I'd ever had protesters. There were two high school students who were wearing sweatshirts that said, "Remember the Trail of Tears." They were very polite, very cordial, came up to me afterwards. They didn't interrupt me, they came up to me afterwards and talked to me, and it was a very cordial dialogue. And I appreciated the fact that high school juniors were that engaged. For Native Americans, this Jacksonian period is extremely important. And for many Native Americans, Jackson is someone whom they revile. He's the enemy, he's the master of genocide and all these things. And so what I say to people when they ask me, what should we think about Jackson today when it comes to Indian removal? What I say is this, and I'll conclude with this. The first thing to understand about Jackson is that you have to understand him within the context of his times, right? To understand history, you have to understand people in the context of their times. He was representative of many people at that time. At the same time, we have to also understand Jackson within the context of our own times. Right? And for me personally, I know not everyone agrees with this, for me personally, that is the best way to approach history. Understand the context of the times, why people did what they did, why things happened the way that they did, but at the same time, also understand what's the lesson we can learn from this, right? And so in 2014, of course, the lessons are obvious. But I think if we do both, that gives us a better understanding of Jackson and helps keep us from simply ignoring him or vilifying him or building him up to be this true champion of democracy. We need to understand his complexity, and hopefully we understand him a little bit better today. Thank you.
To give Dr. Cheatham a copy of this volume on historic Tennessee. This is a project that we worked with the Tennessee Preservation Trust and the Tennessee Historical Commission a few years ago, and it has photos and stories of the homes, many of whom you talked about today, as a thank you. And then also Dr. Beasley gave me, we noticed you were missing one of these, and you need to have a Tennessee War of 1812 lapel pin. And again, as we are not ashamed to promote sales, they are selling those out in the lobby. But before we have our morning break, because we thought we would have a break between the first two and the last two presentations, any questions for Dr. Cheatham? Well, Dr. Cheatham, I would say that means you answered all the questions, and everyone that is also ready for coffee. So let's take about a 15-minute break, and we'll get started again at 10:30 with Dr. Tom Cannon. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Great job. Appreciate it. Great job.
Well, folks, for our second session here in the morning of the symposium on the War of 1812 and the road to New Orleans, it is my great pleasure to introduce a colleague of mine from years back, and then lucky enough to have him as a graduate student at one time at MTSU. And that's Dr. Tom Cannon from Tennessee State Library and Archives. As I said in my opening remarks, Dr. Cannon is the person who has just finished the major study of Tennessee in the War of 1812. It is published this summer from the University Press of Alabama. So we look forward to that publication, but until that day, we get a little sneak preview in Dr. Cannon's remarks this morning on a forgotten chapter in a forgotten conflict, the Battle of Pensacola, which took place 200 years ago this November. So, Dr. Cannon.
Thank you, Van. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank the Tennessee War of 1812 Bicentennial Commission and the Center for Historic Preservation at MTSU, and of course, the people here at Fayetteville for allowing me to come down and speak on a topic that I will speak any time or place at, in the War of 1812. And thanks to Ferris Beasley in particular for coordinating a lot of this. This is a nice facility here, and it was really an ego boost to go to the restroom a little while ago and it says boys on the side, which made me feel really good. I haven't seen that in a long time. But we have a nice panel today, and we have a nice, I think, representation, because we had Dr. Mark Cheatham from the academia level, who gave a really good, insightful talk on Jackson, and then we're going to have Fred Prouty and Ben Nance cover the material culture side of the War of 1812, showing you a demonstration of some of the rifles. And then there's me. As I said, I will speak anytime, any place on this topic, as I have been for the last 15 years. I've always told Dr. Van West I'm cheap and easy. So one of the topics, though, that I'm going to do, I've never did a talk on this particular topic before, probably because, as the title suggests, it is a forgotten campaign. And that's the encounter, or the Battle of Pensacola, in early November of 1814. Now, for us today, most of us, when we think of Pensacola, Florida, well, some of us do at least, think of it in these terms. But of course, if we're going to go back 200 years to 1814, and unfortunately that's probably the only slide you're going to remember out of this whole presentation. But if we go back 200 years to 1814, Pensacola at that time is just a small town, Spanish village actually, with fortifications, and it contained about 500 Spanish soldiers. But our story really begins at the end of the Creek War, and these are the battle sites of that war that is in present-day Alabama. And one of the most recent books that have been dealing with the Creek War is Tohopeka, which was a University of Alabama press release. I was fortunate enough to contribute an essay to that on Tennessee's role in the Creek War. But basically, it's a series of battles, as we know, that culminates in the Treaty of Fort Jackson that Dr. Cheatham alluded to. And one of the things that happens as a result of the Creek War is that Andrew Jackson becomes a major general in the U.S. regular army. We need to distinguish that because up to that point, he is a major general of the Tennessee militia. But once he becomes a major general in the U.S. regular army, that gives him a little more autonomy and a little more power. Certainly his availability of troops, and that will play a big factor. Now, if we look at the southern frontier at that time, you're going to notice that it's really the Floridas with a plural, because it's East and West Florida. East Florida, the capital is at St. Augustine, and West Florida, the capital, Spanish capital, is Pensacola. It is under Spanish rule at this time, and one of the problems that the Americans have with the Floridas in general is that a lot of the slaves that are running away from the southern farms and plantations are running to Spanish Florida, where they are received and they get haven there. Pensacola in particular is of interest to the Americans because it was a trading center for the Indians. As a matter of fact, that's where they got most of their arms and ammunition for the Creek War, is at Pensacola. So Pensacola, in fact, is called by Jackson, he always refers to it as the hotbed of the Creek War. And he always had an inkling to go down there and chastise the Spanish for selling the Indians arms. But of course, he can't really do that because Spain at that time is a neutral country. So for me, Pensacola really represents the international aspects of the War of 1812. It's not just a war between the United States and Great Britain. Once you deal with the Creek War, you introduce the Native Americans, but then when you start talking about the Floridas, you also have to bring Spain into the picture. So if we look at all the different angles of what's going on, it becomes interesting. For instance, if we look at it from the British point of view, they're using Pensacola as a trading post. They have a company called Forbes and Company that trades down there, not just with the Native Americans, but with the Americans who were settling in West Florida. Now, the trading post itself is run by a Scotsman named James Inner-Arity, who's frankly under suspicion by the British. They're not sure of his loyalty, but then again, the British have always been suspicious of Scotsmen in general, so it kind of fits the bill. In fact, James Inner-Arity is somebody to be worthy of suspicion because he is giving information to the Americans all during the War of 1812. Let's face it, most of his customers are Americans. His other clients, as I said, included the Indians who are trading down there, and they're always in debt to the Forbes and Company. In fact, a lot of the annuities that the Indians receive down there, they have to just hand over to Forbes and Company because they owe them so much money. Now, for Spain, their problem is that they're holding on to an empire that they really can't support anymore. And the Floridas represent that very clearly. It's very expensive to send men and materiel over to Florida to man it. As I said, they only had 500 men in the capital at that time in Pensacola. Now, they are allied with Britain in the Napoleonic War, but they're not allied with Britain in the War of 1812, so they are neutral as far as everyone's concerned. And that makes it a little bit difficult for the Americans to go down into the Floridas for any kind of punitive action because it's really breaking international law. Now the Spanish governor of West Florida is a man named Governor Mateo Gonzalez Manrique. And he has the dubious job of trying to contain all of this and keep Spanish interest alive. Now for the Americans and the Indians, it's a different story. The Indians, of course, to them, most of the Indians there are Seminole Indians. It's their homeland. So they have obviously a vested interest in there. For the Americans, for the most part, they've been populating what is known as West Florida for many years now. Spain made it attractive. They offered them cheap land. And so they had no problem living under Spanish rule, believe it or not. Until around 1810, Spain begins to tighten up controls a little bit, makes it more difficult on the settlers there. And in fact, a rebellion occurs in 1810 in which the Americans take over a part of West Florida and create their own state. In 1813, even the U.S. Army goes into Mobile and takes it over for fear of what the British might do, which is to take over Mobile. Now, the British finally arrive on the scene in May of 1814. Why so late? During the Creek War, they had been called upon by the Creeks for help. But because they're tied down with the Napoleonic War in Europe, they don't respond to the Creek Indians. Finally, when they defeat Napoleon the first time and they exile him, now they can devote some arms and men to go into the United States campaign. The problem is, as far as the Creeks are concerned, it's too late, because by then, the Battle of Horseshoe Bend has pretty much checked the Creek War. It's pretty much at an end. Now, what's interesting is that the British have this grandiose plan for the Floridas. What they want to do is they want to gather up all the refugee Creeks that have escaped from the Creek War, and there's about 1,000 of them, it's estimated. And they want to combine that with all these runaway slaves that I mentioned and create a fighting force. Because believe me, if there's nothing more psychologically terrifying to Anglo-Americans, it would be a combined force of blacks and Native Americans, coupled with British regulars. So that's sort of the plan that the British have in terms of creating a diversion in the South from what's going on in Canada, because that's what they're really holding on to, Britain, is Canada. And they're using this campaign in the South at first as a diversionary plan. The other reason why they come into Florida is that somebody has, in London, they had the grandiose idea of taking, as long as we're down in the South, why don't we try to capture New Orleans, because that's really the place that is going to affect the Americans more than anything in that region of the country, if we can capture New Orleans. So the plan, and many people don't realize this, but the plan originally to attack New Orleans is to go from Pensacola, take Mobile, and go over to Baton Rouge and come down into New Orleans, so that it's all land routes. And when that doesn't happen, they have to change their whole strategy and come from the south through water routes, and that changes the whole complexity of the campaign. So this is one of the reasons why this whole campaign for Pensacola becomes very important over time. Now, the person who's in charge of instigating all these plans is a man, a British colonel named Edward Nichols. And he comes into the territory, and by the way, that picture of him is when he's really old. He was much younger at this time. This is the only picture you could find if you go to the internet on Nichols. But he assembles his army, and by the summer of 1814, he has an army of Creek Indians, runaway slaves, and British Marines. And in late August, he issues this proclamation to the people in the area, saying that he's willing, to give slaves their freedom if they join up. Indians will give you back the land that you lost from the Creek War. And by the way, any of you people who are living under American rule in Louisiana, who had just become a state in 1812 and were populated mostly by the French, by the way, we'll give you, if you don't like the American rule, we'll give you your lands back, and we'll give you whatever rule you want back. And so this proclamation is issued. It doesn't have much success, though, because the thought that all the French would join the British is the same thing as having the British thinking that the Scotsmen were going to like them as well. So it really doesn't work out. But in Pensacola, and this actually diagram here is of a later period, but for our purposes it serves well, because the problem that Governor Manrique has is that the British are now in Pensacola by the end of the summer. And he at first welcomes them because that's going to be a deterrent against U.S. invasion. But at the same time, the presence of the British also encourages a U.S. invasion. And what's really important about Pensacola is the cities up here, but the entrance to the bay, to the Gulf of Mexico, is guarded by an important fort called Fort Barrancas, which is right there. If you control that fort, you control the entrance to the bay. So that becomes a key issue. Now, the United States government are aware that the British are in Florida, and Jackson begins to correspond with these officials in Washington by the end of June of 1814, and he's trying to seek approval for some punitive action. If we don't take some steps now, he indicates, we're going to be in trouble later. And once again, he calls Pensacola the hotbed of the war. The Secretary of War, John Armstrong, sends him this letter that's dated July 18th. And it sort of gives Jackson veiled approval for these attacks if you look at the text, right? If you read that, one would think, it sounds pretty much to me like they're giving Jackson the green light, doesn't it? The problem is, and here's where it gets really interesting, the letter doesn't reach Jackson until mid-January of 1815, even though it's dated July 18, 1814. Communications back then were slow, but not that slow. Okay, Jackson should have received this letter at the most several weeks after it was written. He should have received it maybe in late August. But the letter is never sent at that time. And there's always been some speculation that the letter was not sent on purpose. And some people say it was Secretary of State James Monroe who held the letter up. Some suggest even President James Madison. And the reason is this: they know the personality of Andrew Jackson. Dr. Cheatham talked about that inner rage that Jackson had. Believe me, these officials were very well aware of what Jackson was capable of doing. And if he was chomping at the bit to get into Pensacola, government officials figured he would. And if they don't acknowledge it ahead of time, then they could put the blame solely on Jackson by saying, well, we didn't sanction this. We gave him no green light to do this. So they hold this letter up. In the meantime, Jackson is chomping at the bit, and he's continuing to write to the government, and he's saying, what he's saying is absolutely nothing because I can't get this to work. Let's see. All right. Thank you, Myers. He's telling Armstrong, please let me go at these guys. Okay, we've got to get down there and we've got to take some action. And one of the reasons why Jackson's getting very, very nervous is that he keeps hearing these wild rumors that are flying around down there. Rumors such as 10,000 British troops are about to land at Pensacola, 25,000 more await in Bermuda, and Russia has offered 50,000 troops to aid in England's conquest of U.S., none of which are true. But Jackson's buying into all this, and he's getting really, really anxious. So what happens is something fortuitous for him, and that is he's writing Manrique, and he's telling him, if you don't, put an end to this, I'm going to make you plan a visit to see you. He playfully couches it. He wants to pay him a visit. He's acknowledged that you're harboring the fugitive Creeks. You're allowing the British to man your Spanish forts, a clear violation of neutrality. If you don't take care of that, I'm going to come down and maybe you'll treat my men the same way that you treat the British. Well, what happens is that in September of 1814, the British make a move that Colonel Nichols wasn't allowed to. He's sort of maybe the Andrew Jackson of the British because his government didn't sanction this, but he makes a move to capture Mobile, and to do this he has to capture Fort Bower, which is on Mobile Point. So he launches a combined naval and land force consisting of 4 frigates and a force of British Marines and Indians that attack the fort, commanded by Major William Lawrence. Now, William Lawrence had been advised or warned by our friend James Innerarity ahead of time that this attack was going to happen, so he was prepared for it. Actually, the land force proved too small, the waters were too shallow for the ships, and the British were repulsed with 24 dead, 44 wounded, while the Americans lost 4 killed and 5 wounded. But the main thing that this battle does, it gives Jackson the excuse he was looking for, because he said that the British expedition had been outfitted at Pensacola, a clear violation of neutrality. So, what he does, he begins amassing an army to attack Pensacola. And he calls upon his old friend, General John Coffee, his right-hand man, who was with him throughout the entire war, and to get his Tennessee volunteers together. And as we mentioned, he's Major General of the U.S. Regulars, so he's able to get many contingents of that U.S. Regular Army personnel involved, the 3rd, the 39th, and the 44th U.S. Infantries. And he even gets a group of Choctaw Indians to join the cause, which I always thought was, it gives that very diversified army that becomes a little important later on that I'll mention. Anyway, they all gather, all these elements gather around Fort Montgomery up there. And he now writes, Jackson now writes to, and by the way, this is the breakdown of the forces that he had, approximately 3,000 troops, although some historians even say it might have been 4,000. But Jackson writes to James Monroe, who is now the Secretary of War as well as the Secretary of State. He writes to him on October 23rd saying that he's about to attack Pensacola, with or without permission from the government. And Monroe sends him a letter dated December 7th, 1814, way after the battle has occurred, a month after the battle. And Monroe cheekily replies, don't attack, but if you already did, declare that you did it for the sole purpose of freeing it from British violations, which is exactly what happened. See, the government's they know Jackson, they know what he's going to do and what he's capable of doing. So, in the meantime, the British-Spanish relations in Pensacola are deteriorating. Nichols enters the town, he takes it over like a dictator. And not only does he demand a lot of supplies from the Spanish that they don't really have to give, but he takes a lot of the local slaves from their owners and puts them into the army. And then when he hears that Jackson is going to come with this large army, he tells the inhabitants there that Jackson's coming to Pensacola with an army of 7,000 men, and they've been promised to pillage the town if you surrender it. They're granted 24 hours of just pillaging. Of course, this wasn't true, but it sure scared the inhabitants enough. Now, on the evening of November 6th, Jackson arrives. He comes to the main fort, which is Fort San Miguel, and he sends a messenger with a white flag to give a message to Governor Manrique. Well, the messenger gets fired on from the fort. He retreats, he goes back, he tells Jackson. Jackson says, well, try it again. Maybe they didn't see your flag. So he goes the second time, and he gets fired on again, this time by cannon fire, so he begins to get the idea that he's not welcome. So he goes back to Jackson, and then they have the wise idea of sending a Spanish sergeant that they had captured along the march to Pensacola, and he is allowed into the fort. And the message that Jackson has is, surrender the fort, this fort, and all your other installations, including Fort Barrancas, and that if any bloodshed occurs, it'll be on your hands, Governor Manrique, and you have till 6 a.m. tomorrow morning for a reply. Well, Manrique deliberates, and he sends a message back at 7 o'clock instead of 6, and he refuses Jackson's demand, saying, well, you know what's happened? The British aren't here anymore. They left, and the Indians left too. So really, there's no reason why you should have to come into my town, and if you do and shed blood, it'll be on your hands. Well, the British have evacuated the town, and they've sent the Indians out of the town on the other side of Pensacola Bay, out of harm's way. The British are waiting on ships in the harbor to see what plays out. Now, on December 7th, in the morning, Jackson leaves 500 men behind. He is really on the west side of town. But what he does, he leaves the diversionary force and then marches all his army around to the other side and comes in from the east where there's not many defensive. He attacks in 3 columns. The U.S. regulars are on the left, the Choctaws are on the right, and the Tennessee troops are in the center. The U.S. regulars attack down the main street of the town, called Palafox Street, where 2 pieces of Spanish artillery, which constitutes their defense, they're set up, and the regulars take the artillery, but not before the Spanish get a few shots off and they kill several Americans. The other resistance is very light, and within minutes, the whole town is captured by Jackson. If anyone's ever been up to Lafayette Square in Washington, D.C., where the equestrian statue is of Andrew Jackson, well, those cannons that are in Lafayette Square, those are the 2 cannons that I just mentioned in Pensacola. They were captured and taken by Jackson and later taken up to Washington. So all of a sudden, Manrique comes running out with a white flag of surrender and saying he's ready to negotiate. So Jackson says, okay, I want you to surrender all your forts, including Fort Barrancas. We're going to take it over in the morning. Well, what happens is that in the meantime, the British leave Pensacola, but on the way out of Pensacola Bay, they blow up Fort Barrancas so that it's basically useless. And by the time the Americans get there the next morning, all they have is a rubble of what was a fort there. So really, Jackson feels that his mission has been accomplished. He feels that the fort's no longer usable for anybody, and he had the satisfaction of seeing the British flee, and he's made the Spanish surrender to him. So he decides to leave, and much to the regret of the Spanish population, who actually now embraces him somewhat as a hero because he treated them so well. They had been thought that they were all the women were going to be raped and the town was going to be burned to cinders, when in fact Jackson's army was in the best professional army behavior that was possible. As even this quote saying that Colonel Nichols was even impressed how they came into the town in such good order and left in such good order. It was remarked that even the Choctaw Indians didn't do any scalping, as they were wont to do, especially since some of their warriors had been wounded by the Spanish. So now he leaves Pensacola, and he figures that he'd better notify the United States government what he did. So he writes to Secretary of Monroe on November 14th. He explains his actions knowing that he might lose his job as Major General of the U.S. Army. But what happens, in fact, is that government feels, well, there's really no harm done, and besides, Jackson moves on to New Orleans, where he has this enormously popular victory. So subsequently, there's really no action taken on Jackson. He sort of got away with it, so to speak. So the theme to this seminar that we have today, or symposium, is called The Road to New Orleans. And certainly one of the road to New Orleans, one of the stops is Pensacola. And the significance, therefore, and I think one of the most important ones, was that, as I mentioned before, it caused the British to abandon the plans for the attack they had of that northern route and land route, and wound up coming from the south, a very difficult way they had to attack, and the logistics were a nightmare for them, and that's one of the reasons why they lost the Battle of New Orleans. Secondly, you have the Indians are no longer playing a major role in the southern theater of the war, although Jackson will pay another visit to Pensacola in a few years in the First Seminole War, but that's a topic for another seminar. The third thing that I wanted to mention was that Jackson learns how to lead and coordinate diverse forces, which is what I mean by diversified army, because he has regulars, he has volunteers, he's got militia, he's got Indians, and he's controlling all of those. Well, this is the exact same type of army that he's going to have in New Orleans, where he's going to have militiamen, Tennessee volunteers, U.S. regulars, and he's even going to have a contingent of some Choctaw warriors with him. So the experience he gets from the Pensacola campaign is going to be enormous. And oddly enough, the one negative aspect is that because the British attacked Mobile and were not successful, he still thinks, Jackson, after Pensacola, that that's going to be the theater. That's going to be the main thrust of the British. They're going to try to attack Mobile again and try their plan to go through Baton Rouge and down Louisiana. That doesn't happen. And it takes a lot of prompting by the U.S. officials to say, get your behind over to New Orleans, because that's where the action really is. And he finally relents and shows up on December 1st, and the rest, as we know, is history. Now, if you want to learn more about the commission that sponsored this event, you can go to that first website. If you want to know a little bit something about the Tennessee in the War of 1812, that's what the second website is for. And for you genealogists, the third website has some brief regimental histories in it that you may want to visit so that you can flesh out where some of your ancestors may have fought and the type of units they were in. So I'll conclude with this. Oh, how did that get there? Oh, well, okay. Shameless plug. I don't care. You know, just I'll take whatever, whoever will support me. I don't. So thank you for your attention, and I'll put this back on here so that I can take any of your questions if you have any. Wow, I did a good job too, Mark. See?
I have one for you.
Yes, sir.
Were there other tribes that were there at Pensacola? Because there's a mention of William McIntosh being there.
Yes. No, you mean in terms of the American forces?
Yes.
No, the only forces that I've come across in that particular campaign were just the Choctaw contingent, and not Chickasaw. Okay. Sir.
More of a comment than a question, but I just want to say that the U.S. Army Infantry School at Fort Benning has used that very aspect of this campaign, showing how Army can be made up of regulars, militiamen or National Guardsmen, and indigenous crews, and how they can coordinate into a single combat unit. They've taken note of that already. And also, your last reference up there, the regional histories that you put together.
Yes.
Have been invaluable, man. Use them over and over again.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Really helpful.
I put those together many years ago, back in the late 90s, and because no one had ever done it before. You know, people have asked me, how'd you get into this? And I got railroaded into it because I was working for the archives. I was the new kid on the block, even though I was old. I was the new kid on the block, and they gave me an assignment. We want you to find out everything, all the sources we have at the archives here dealing with the War of 1812. Oh, God. So I thought, what is that? So I started doing it, and when I was researching it, I became fascinated with that time period. And I began to realize that people like Crockett and Houston, and not only Jackson, but all these really interesting Tennesseans participated in it, but it was also so crucial to the time period of Tennessee history. And God forbid I should say this with Civil War historians here, but in some ways, it was actually more pivotal to Tennessee than the Civil War was. Sir?
Sir, does anyone know if all the volunteers assembled in Camp Lum for the War of 1812. Did they all come here to assemble the army? Does anyone know?
Yeah, some did and some didn't. It depends on the time period and which campaign. Now, for instance, in this campaign, there were probably some that did come through Camp Blunt, okay? But for most of the engagements of the Creek War, all right, that Jackson's army, that Jackson was the leader of, practically all of them came through Fayetteville. So you literally had thousands of Tennesseans. They were West Tennesseans at the time. Of course, that's what we call Middle Tennessee now. But the East Tennesseans were under a different commander, under Major General John Cock, and they rendezvoused down at Ross's Landing, which is Chattanooga. Yes, sir.
I have my great-grandfather's brother signed up in Lebanon County, Tennessee for
Right.
the War of 1812.
Right?
He's buried here in Lincoln County. I assumed that he came to Fayetteville from there to assemble, and that's how the family wound up, because they were living in Virginia, which probably was just across the line.
There are 10 million stories in Tennessee, and you are one of them. I hear those type of stories on a daily basis, I can assure you, and I'm always fascinated by them, and I can never hear enough of them. Thank you. Sir?
A question about Houston. You mentioned East Tennessee.
Yes.
And he was here, but he's from Maryville. How did he end up here?
Well, actually, I don't want to burst anybody's bubble, okay? Because I wrote an article, and I sort of exposed in the article that I felt that Sam Houston was never at Camp Blunt. And I got some negative feedback from that. But that's the part of being a historian. You know, you have to take the good with the bad. And I really learned a lot about public history in doing that article, because I was the hotshot historian that was going to sort of tell you the truth about everything, right? And then when I started really getting this negative feedback, I started to realize, seriously, I started to realize that the public memory and the traditions of a place, time and place, are just as important to a community as what is the reality, quote unquote. And I don't have any absolute proof he wasn't here. I just go by what the records are available. The records that are available show that he probably was not through here. He was with the 39th U.S. Infantry, and I had never come across any reference to it that they came through Fayetteville. Anything else? Someone back there? Yeah, go ahead. Well, that's an interesting question. They have, first of all, the allegiance was, if you're going to take sides in the War of 1812, okay, the Choctaws naturally gravitated towards the American and not the British, as the Cherokee did. And one wonders, why would they do that, considering how they got treated afterwards in the war? Well, of course, they didn't know that was going to be that way afterwards. And I think some of them may have seen the writing on the wall, and I think that they thought if they gave their allegiance to the U.S., that they would in fact be treated more fairly, okay? And in some cases, there was intertribal warfare too. So you had a long legacy of Creeks versus Choctaws, Chickasaw, et cetera, et cetera. So you have to take that into account too. But it's a very complex picture, and it's an excellent question. One more question? Yes, sir.
How did we order your book?
Oh, my God. Well, God bless you. It's my brother. You see? University of Alabama Press. If you just Google University of Alabama Press, I believe they have something on their website for a new book. And I hope when it comes out, I hope that this won't be the last time that I'll be here. As I said, I am cheap and easy. And anytime there's anything to do with War of 1812, I'll be here. And I want to thank, again, you all for your attention. And keep in mind, please, that it's real easy to get into the War of 1812 because we're 200th anniversary Americans are fascinated by numbers, 50th, sesquicentennial. But my fervent wish is that even when we're at the 201st anniversary, that events like this will maybe stay in your mind and get you interested in a time period that I think is one of the most fascinating for Tennessee. Thank you very much.
We would like to present Tom with a book, the Tennessee Preservation book.
Thank you.
Historic Tennessee. I'll have to mention that Tom is a co-worker, but I saw him more when I worked down the street. There seems to be an invisible shield that I can't get to the third floor to see him, but he is a great resource for us at the State Library and Archive. So when you have War of 1812 questions, he is the man to ask.
Thank you, Mercy.
I might back up another question that you had about Sam Houston. Another common myth is that Sam Houston was in the Tennessee militia. He was not. He was in the regular army. And since Camp Blunt was not a mustering ground for the regular troops, the chances are he did not pass through here. There is one possibility, though, and that he may have come back through here after Horseshoe Bend when he was extremely in very bad health and had been wounded several times. So there is the possibility, although there's no evidence for it, that he may have passed through here heading back to recover from his wounds. But even David Wright admits that, maybe I shouldn't have put Sam Houston in there in the painting. But again, I think the important thing to remember is that as a great painting that symbolizes the confluence of very influential antebellum Tennesseans and how they are connected to this war. And we do know that certainly Jackson and Crockett did come through here, so.
Well, one thing that might support that, and I don't know the history of that, the Roman doctor treated him, and then he might
Right.
have been coming back through possibly.
It's possible, but again, it's all conjecture at this point. I'll tell you what, we're not going to take a long break, but if you'll give us about 3 minutes to get our next speaker set up, and then we'll get going in just a second. Our next two speakers, I think, are going to be of great interest to us all. In our opening symposium in Nashville, the great War of 1812 historian Don Hickey made the comment that the Pennsylvania rifle / the Kentucky rifle was primarily a Pennsylvania weapon, and I about had a stroke in the back row, and didn't call him out in front of everybody, but I did have a long conversation with him afterwards, after which I then sent him a survey that had been done in conjunction by the next two fellows that really did document Tennessee gun makers really in the entire antebellum period. And Don Hickey has since written me and said, I'm so glad I came to Tennessee and am not making a fool of myself around the country, and sorry I insulted the Tennesseans. But regardless, the two guys who are coming up next are going to be a thrill, and I've known both of them for many years. Ben Nance is with the Division of Archaeology. He has an undergraduate degree from Tennessee Tech and a master's degree from Middle Tennessee State University. I first met Ben when I was a graduate student at MTSU. He probably does not remember it, but he came into our intro class and talked to us about archaeology. And I decided right then and there that spending hours in the sun in Middle Tennessee or throughout the South digging up stuff was not going to be in my future. So I thank him for that and saving me a lot of heartache and a lot of sweat, but I am glad that people do it. And the information that they provide to the rest of us is invaluable. Ben will speak first, and then will be followed Fred Prouty. Now, there are lots of stories I know about Fred Prouty, and he gave me $20 to not tell them all. 20 may not be enough, but I've known Fred Prouty since I was 14 years old, and he was once a young drummer. Now he readily admits he's the oldest drummer that has ever put on a uniform. And some of you may recognize Fred from being part of the Camp Blunt project down here. Fred worked in archaeology for many years, and now he is head of the Tennessee Wars Commission, does a fantastic job around the state working to preserve and interpret military sites around the state of Tennessee. Fred most recently has been working on the efforts to preserve the Camp Blunt site, at least what remains of it. And Fred is a dear friend and a very knowledgeable fellow, so you enjoy hearing from both of these guys. And now, without further delay, Ben Nance.
Thank you, Myers. I'm glad to hear I talked you out of archaeology. I'm just sorry you didn't choose a lucrative profession. As Myers said, Fred and I are going to divide this presentation. Originally, I was going to speak while Fred just held the gun to make sure no one left, but we decided to both speak on different parts of this project. In almost every iconic image that portrays settlers coming into the wilderness, you will see in that image some type of firearm, usually a rifle. And that's the case of this image of Daniel Boone leading settlers into the wilderness. You see Boone and several of the other men in the image holding these rifles. Also, David Crockett is almost synonymous with the long rifle. Crockett is almost always portrayed with a rifle. Crockett, of course, served in the War of 1812, and he's also often depicted as going down swinging at the Alamo with his rifle. Now, if I recall correctly, this would be the Fess Parker David Crockett and not the John Wayne or Billy Bob Thornton Crockett. I'm sure just about everyone in here could probably sing the first verse of the Ballad of Davy Crockett, which tells us that he was born on a mountaintop in Tennessee. Several of you might not know, though, that there are actually 20 verses to this song. And you'll be glad to hear I'm not going to sing any of them. Of these 20 verses, 5 of them deal with Crockett's involvement in the Creek War. One of them says that the Tennessee Volunteers are going to put Andy Jackson's regulars to shame because they got the guns with a surefire aim. And these, of course, are the rifles. Rifles were valuable, very valuable artifacts on the frontier. You had to have a rifle, and that's why you see all these iconic images of people carrying them. Rifles were necessary for hunting, for providing food for your table, for defense. And as more and more settlers moved into these areas already settled by Native Americans, it brought them into conflict with them, and there were a lot of battles with these guns being used on both sides. They were also used as trade goods to these same Indian tribes, and many of them traded for these weapons. William Bean is regarded as the first permanent white settler in Tennessee. William Bean was also a gun maker, as were many of the Bean family. And so in 1990, the Division of Archaeology decided that we needed to study this topic of Tennessee gun makers more closely because there was potential for archaeological sites that we had not studied yet. Now, when you think of archaeology, you think of digging holes, nice square holes. You take all the dirt, you sift it, you look for the features in the soil and also the artifacts that are in the soil. And that is an important part of archaeology and a lot of what we do. But over the years, we've done a number of these thematic surveys where instead of digging, we will research a particular topic, a particular theme, and we will try to record as many archaeological sites related to that theme as possible. Some examples of ones we've done over the years, we did a very large study of Tennessee potters and pottery sites. That report was just published not long ago and actually is available digitally on our website. One that Fred and I spent much time working on was a survey of Civil War sites. When we began this one, there were only 27 recorded archaeological sites in our database that had a Civil War military component. And we knew that had to be greatly underrepresented, so we began to do the research and the field work, And by the time we had finished a multi-year survey, we had recorded more than 400 archaeological sites related to the Civil War. A few other examples: we did a study of the Trail of Tears, the removal routes used by the Cherokee during the removal. We looked for these old road segments that might have been left over from those original roads. Also a study of the iron industry on the western Highland Rim, the Revolutionary War in Tennessee. One that surprises some people, we studied World War II in Tennessee. Besides a lot of training camps in Tennessee, during World War II, over 800,000 troops came to Middle Tennessee just to train in realistic war games. And one of my current projects is I'm studying Rosenwald schools in Tennessee. These were early 20th century schools built for black students. And so it's this approach that we use when we began studying Tennessee gun makers. Now, I said one of the goals of this is to record archaeological sites related to the theme, and we also put out a report at the end of it, a written report, to summarize our findings. When we began the project to study Tennessee gun makers, it was in 1990, and 24 years ago, it was a little more difficult to do research in census records. Now you could just go to Ancestry.com and put in a search term. But 24 years ago, we had to go to the microfilm, and for each of the 95 counties, we had to go through roll after roll of microfilm looking for anyone listed as a gunsmith, gun maker. We found one as a gun stocker, or anything related to guns. And so it was a very time-consuming process, and that's when we realized we probably should have left ourselves more than the 5 months that we had allotted for this project, whereas most of our projects are at least a year. After compiling the data, we did get a chance to go out and look for some of these sites, but much to our surprise, we had found almost 400 people listed in some sort of profession making guns in Tennessee. It was many more than we had expected, and we had not left ourselves much time for the field work. But we did get out, and we got to record some of these sites. This is the site of the Charles Bean gun shop. This is Fred standing in the middle of the foundations. Only the foundations were left on this site, and that's a lot of what we found, was that there were not many standing buildings. But what we also found were a lot of the descendants of these gun makers, and many of them still had some of these weapons that had been handed down over many years. This is a descendant of Charles Bean, whose shop site I showed you in the previous slide. And he is holding a Charles Bean rifle that had been handed down through many generations in this family. Now, on the subject of standing buildings, we did find a few, but in some cases, family history and actual history kind of blur each other. This is a standing outbuilding on the site of one of the gun makers, on the gun maker's property, and family tradition had it that this could have been his gun shop, although I think it's more likely this is gunsmith Samuel Keller's smokehouse. In Williamson County, there's a site that's called Forge Seat. The house and the shop are still standing, and these were the homes. This was the home of Samuel and Andrew Crockett. The home is still standing, and this is a picture of what is called the Forge Building, and you can tell it's been added onto over the years. It has several wings on it. It's been covered over, but this was the Forge Building. The Crockett's are known to have made weapons during the 1812 period, and it's said that they supplied some of the Tennessee militia with weapons on their way with Jackson to New Orleans. Some of that's just family legend. So this brings up the question, since we are archaeologists, we don't have to have a standing building. We love digging for what's left of the buildings. And it brings up the question of what we would find if we were able to excavate the site of a gun maker's shop. Gun making involves so many tools because in the whole process you have blacksmithing and you have carpentry, and you have all kinds of specialized things that they have to do for these weapons from start to finish. This is a depiction of a gun shop, and it's a little cartoonish, but it gives you an idea of how many tools you would have in a typical gun shop. You see the walls are just lined with all sorts of tools, and we would expect if we excavated a gun shop to find not only parts of guns, but a lot of these types of tools that would identify it as a gun maker's shop. Another site we were able to record during this short time period was the site of Jason Harris's gun shop. Again, no standing building. Family tradition had it that it was out behind the barn, and we were able to take advantage of the fact that this field had just been plowed to look through there and see the artifacts that had been turned up. And there was enough debris for us to determine that there had been a building there, and that, coupled with our research and the family history, we thought was enough to record this as the site of Jason Harris's gun shop. And again, here we met descendants of Jason Harris. This is Jason Harris's grandson holding a Jason Harris rifle, and also grandson and great-grandson of Jason Harris, holding not only a Jason Harris rifle, but a Jason Harris fiddle, because not only was he a gun maker, he was a fiddle maker, and also said to be a silversmith and a locksmith. Family history has it that he was once arrested for forging his own silver coins, but he was released when they found that his coins actually had more silver in them than the official government coins. So we concluded our 5-month survey by listing over 400 people who were making guns in Tennessee and recording only about 12 sites. But usually with these reports, we see them not as the end, but the beginning of further research, and that was very true with this. Now, since we concluded this, I have been able to do a little further research and record several more sites. In all of these surveys, we run into people, and these surveys begin to have a lot of crossovers in them. We were doing our survey of World War II sites, and the person was telling me where a World War II bivouac was, and he said, yes, it was up there. It was on my great-grandfather's land near his gun shop. And he actually had 2 great-grandfathers who were gun makers. And so he was able to show us a lot of the things that had been handed down to him. This is a Henry Brewer rifle. The lock on this is actually a replacement. The original flintlock had been replaced by a percussion lock, and this man wanted it to look original, so he took off the percussion lock and put on a replica flintlock. But the rest of the rifle is original. It's a nice walnut stock, has the double set trigger and the brass trigger guard. And he also has a lot of Henry Brewer's tools. Brewer, in addition to being a gun maker, was a carpenter, and most gun makers had to have carpentry skills in carving these stocks for the guns. These tools are almost works of art in themselves, and this is only about a third of what he showed us, which I think was only a small part of what he actually had. Some of the more interesting things he had, in the center here is a measuring device for measuring powder and shot for the weapons. And on either side of it are gang molds for casting bullets. The one on the right will cast 6 round shot at once. The one on the left is interesting because when you open it up, you see it will cast either a round shot or a conical shot, both of the same caliber. And I don't think I've ever seen one like that before. And that, of course, is the muzzle of the rifle that I showed you earlier, the Brewer rifle. There were several of these gun makers we found that were manufacturing guns during the War of 1812, and many of their weapons could have gone with the troops. We don't know exactly how many. We haven't progressed to that point in our study. It is interesting that a couple of the gun makers themselves served in the Army, in the militia during the war. Elisha Bull was one of them who served in the mounted infantry. He had probably just started making guns about the time he served during the Creek War. and he came back after the war and spent several decades making rifles. So that kind of gives you an overview of what we did to research these gun makers, and I hope that we can continue this process and record many more of these sites. But at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Fred Prouty. Fred and I worked on this survey together when Fred was with the Division of Archaeology. He's now moved on to the Wars Commission, and he's going to tell you a little bit more, some of the specifics about the weapons themselves.
Tis a pleasure to be with you today, and thanks, Ben. It's been a long time relationship, great working partner, and a good friend. We had a lot of neat times on those surveys, and several of which we ran into a couple of stills that we backed up once we ran across them. And another one with this peculiar little plant that had 5 leaves on it. And we said, you know, we just need to leave. A lot of wonderful adventures. First, I'd like to thank all of the Fayetteville preservation partners who are my dear friends, who have helped us at the state level to preserve a portion of this important Fayetteville Camp Blunt historic site for future generations, and as potential tourist destination for Tennessee and the nation at large. I want you to know how important this site is to us as Tennesseans and to the nation. This is where we coined the phrase volunteers of Tennessee, right out there next to the river. There are only 9 1812 sites in Tennessee that would actually be places that we could do some type of interpretation. But Camp Blunt property has the potential for a wonderful interpretive system of trails, signage, kiosk, and I'll be glad to send a digital version of the Camp Blunt preservation plan that the Wars Commission put together. And it includes a trail that has the information on Native American history in Tennessee, the history of Camp Blunt, and another trail, the life and times of the town of Fayetteville. These are things that I will be working with through the Wars Commission to help fund this type of signage and trail system, and with the help of hopefully a 501c group, the Friends of Camp Blunt. We'll be able to work with you folks directly and furnish you all the assistance we can. So I'm very excited about that, and think of this as a new destination for tourism in Tennessee. What I'll be talking about today, here in the next few minutes, I call it lock, stock, and barrel, and we'll get to some of these phrases in a minute, but just want to kind of bring you up to date. In order to talk about the guns of 1812, we need to review the role of the long rifle and the musket in the American Revolutionary War, which was, by the way, just about 29 years prior to the War of 1812. So you had a lot of veterans that were serving in the War of 1812, and they brought with them whatever rifle they had and used prior to this. It could have been a captured British musket. So an interesting point. Variety, when we're going to talk about the rifle and the musket. I'm not going to go into all the different versions of it, but we will go over just the basics. Variety was the word for firearms of the Revolutionary War Continental soldier, and we need to look at the Continental soldier first. This is where all this derives from. And my talk will include the rifles of Tennessee. There were muskets, musketoons, carbines, rifles, fusils, pistols, wall guns with many variations, and each had its own type of caliber. They reached the soldiers' hands by a variety of routes. The soldiers used them in a variety of ways. There was no such thing as a single standard. Even calibers varied, though attempts were made to keep them as uniform as possible. It was a nightmare for the military to try to get the right caliber ammo to their troops, who had variations on the theme, many, many calibers. The individual states were responsible for providing arms to the regiments they supplied for the Continental Line, while the Congress armed the other Continental troops. Even here, however, there was a variety. Both the states and Congress purchased arms of the American gunsmiths and dealers. Some states and Congress also purchased arms abroad. There were gifts of arms that found their way into both state-supplied regiments and the congressional troops. Guns were captured from the enemy and confiscated from Tories and soldiers, especially in the beginning of the war, and they brought their own guns with them when they enlisted. If they were sound and serviceable, few questions were asked about the model or the source. All were gratefully received in those early days of our young republic. Of all types of individual firearms, the musket was by far the most important. Contrary to what you may have heard, the rifle won the Revolutionary War. No, it didn't. And we're going to talk about that. It played a very important part and later became what we have today in our military, our specialized riflemen and snipers. And we'll talk about that in a minute. This was the workhorse of the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, the musket. The bulk of the troops in the Continental Line were regular infantry. They were the core of the Army. Cavalry and riflemen were spectacular and highly useful in given situations, and the artillery was handy resource, but the major pitched battle encounters were decided by steady lines of infantry with the musket as their weapon. And during the Revolutionary and War of 1812, the musket was a single-shot, smooth-bore musket, muzzle-loading musket. It was about 4.5 feet long, had a caliber of 69 to 80, and was fired by flintlock. The lock was an ingenious device that had been invented in France around 1610. And my good friend Ron Westfall of the Tennessee State Museum and a fellow living history fanatic, as I have been over 30 years, has volunteered to demonstrate the use of the military musket on the battlefield. So, Ron, if you want to come on up, we can do that and show you just how that was accomplished. And then we'll talk more about the formation in line of battle. So, Ron, come on up. And we'll point out briefly, Ron, you want to talk? Come on over here where they can see you. Could you talk briefly about what you have on?
Well, I'm dressed basically in a rifle frock over civilian trousers and shirt, which would have been a typical militia uniform. Hat is a round hat. This was, again, a civilian headgear. This was the cultural equivalent of a baseball cap today. Inside there's a cockade, pressed leather with a pewter eagle. That really is the only outstanding device in my wear, my clothing. It indicates that I'm under military command. On some occasions, I would also have a nice little white feather plume on the top of my hat, but I don't wear that too often. I'm armed with this is a replica model 1795 Springfield musket, which is based upon the French 1766, I think it is, musket. France being allied with the United States colonies during the Revolutionary War. It was what we copied our first mass-produced firearms from. Not only were they made in Springfield, but there were also large numbers of contractors who were making these for the federal government in the early 1800s. So a soldier that was issued one of these or drew one from the state stores, it may have been made in Springfield, it may have been made in Philadelphia, Rhode Island. There were any number of manufacturers of them all over the eastern seaboard. It is flintlock. We have a pan here, a hole in the side of the barrel communicates with that pan. Small squib of powder is poured from the cartridge. I'm not going to do this. We'll do this outside maybe this afternoon. Cartridge is torn, small squib of powder, closed into this position. Pour the rest of the powder in. The ball is also part of the cartridge that is dropped in the barrel. Ramrod. Come to the ready. Soldiers now take aim, pulls the gun to full cock, present, fire, bang. Start all over again. Good soldier could do about 3 of those a minute. Also, look to the bayonet. Preferably not have the bayonet fixed until you absolutely need it. It has a tendency to pull the barrel down. It's awkward to load with it on there. There were some cases during the period where the United States experimented with raising the bayonet onto the musket so that they wouldn't have to have a carriage for them. That wasn't very successful. I don't know what else to say about it.
Well, Ron, that's great. Can I show them just one thing while you're
Sure.
standing here? These are some of the terms that you hear about. You don't know where they came from. You hear of the lock, stock, and barrel. That's where it comes from. This is the lock of the gun. So he says, I want to buy that lock, stock, and barrel. That's where it comes from. Lock, stock, and barrel. Another one, it's interesting. This is called the pan. And the pan flashes. That term may be a little archaic now, but oh, he was just a flash in the pan. That's where that comes from. Also, the other term, don't go off half-cocked. Well, that comes from this. The gun, when placed in half-cock, is the safety, and it won't go off. You have to pull it to full cock before it will fire. So don't go off half-cocked. That's where that comes from. And my favorite one, with the soldiers, most of them were tall enough to stand like this. If they didn't have their gun on half-cock, or say the mechanism inside was weak, and they happened to kick this, they might incur a very, very terrible accident. And that's where the term, don't go shooting your mouth off, comes from. And there are several terms several troops that actually had this happen. I have a wonderful gravestone marker, a photograph of it at home, who talks about a soldier who was in not line of battle, but during a rehearsal and practice, and he did that very thing, was able to kick that off, and it killed him, of course. So just a few things that you would think about when you think about the musket. Ron, thanks so much. And he also mentioned that this was what was prescribed by General Jackson for
Yes.
his troops. Thanks, Ron. Appreciate your help. Give Ron a hand. The basic information for infantry soldier armed with such a musket was the line of battle. As taught by von Steuben, as we used to say at Colonial Williamsburg, this consisted of 2 ranks of men, shoulder to shoulder, with a line of file closers in the rear to take place of fallen comrades as they marched into battle. In this formation, the regiments advanced to attack, and it was also, they would receive the charge of the enemy in that same line. Given the single-shot muzzle-loading weapons of the day, it is a practical formation, even though it sounds crazy. My wife always, we were watching the beginning of one of the World War II shows where the troops are landing, I think it's Saving Private Ryan, and the troops are landing on the beach and being decimated, and Cheryl would get so mad. That is so stupid. Why are they doing that? And I, bless her heart, I understand her feelings about that, but in this situation, this was a practical formation for the time. The usual procedure in an attack was to advance within sure range of the enemy. Some people say 30 yards, or it's between 30 and 50 yards. Fire a volley, then charge to decide the issue with the bayonet hand to hand. In receiving a charge, the line would wait until the advancing enemy was within range, about that same distance, fire a volley, load again if possible, and fire one or two more volleys before the enemy closed on them. Volley firing from the line of battle was very formal practice. All loading and shooting was done by command. There was little aiming. The volley was delivered directly ahead or to the right or left oblique, as commanded by your commanding officer. The theory was to lay down a field of fire, and consequently, rapidity of fire was prized much more than accuracy. Thus, the musket, which could be loaded rapidly, was considered a fine weapon, even though the accuracy left something to be desired. Some idea of the speed of loading and firing expected of soldiers armed with a musket can be obtained from the following entry in a military treatise of 1768. Quote, "No recruit to be dismissed from drill till he is expert with the flintlock, as to load and fire 15 times in 3 minutes and 3/4. That's pretty fast, isn't it, Ron? This would mean a sustained fire of one shot every 15 seconds, a rate which would assure at least 2 volleys at an approaching enemy in an average charge. During the Battle of New Orleans in 1815, Andrew Jackson's main line of fortifications held approximately 3,918 soldiers, of which 976 were U.S. regulars, so they were firing either French Charleville's Model 1766 or the new Springfield Model 1795. All muskets, all firing at about that rate. These were regulars. They trained around the clock, and they could put out that type of firing. The remainder of the troops, those other 3,000 some odd men, had rifles or muskets, probably earlier Spanish or even French muskets, and we will never really know for sure who was armed with what. But once again, contrary to popular belief, we don't believe that the Battle of New Orleans was won completely with the long rifle, and not just the rifle alone. The musket played a big part of that. Firepower would have been an unbelievable wall of lead striking massed British troops who had really no place to go. Reminds me a lot of the Battle of Franklin, right there next to the Carter House, where they lost 7,000 plus men who could not break through those entrenchments and had to literally reform under fire, as Thomas Cartwright tells me, maybe 13 times. Terrible. Thus, it was often the case a charge involved only one regiment on each side, and if each regiment consisted of 500 men, it would mean that the attacking force would have to suffer the effect of 1,000 bullets in 2 volleys in the 20 or 25 seconds it would take to negotiate a charge of less than 100 yards. The second volley would be received, if delivered properly, at a range of no more than 30 yards. And when you're shooting a 69 caliber or 70 caliber round, that's devastating. If the charge were more than 100 yards, and if there were obstacles to be surmounted, it was necessary to halt and consolidate your forces after the effects of one of those volleys. Then the attacking force would have to withstand 500 or possibly 1,500 more shots. This is just with 500 men in front of you. It should also be remembered that the attacking force was not spread out in a manner which modern infantrymen advance under fire. It was compact and solid, a mass of men, a perfect target for fire from another compact body of men at point-blank range. Accuracy would have been superfluous in this type of warfare. Speed was everything. Speed for defending the force, to pour as many bullets into the attacking force as possible. Speed for attacking into the forces at close range. with your adversary before it had to be, before it could be seriously decimated on their own. There were some instances, however, in which accurate weapons were to be desired, where the musket was weak. Troops detached to attack flankers on the march through hostile territories, pickets, rangers, other similar groups such as skirmishers, were the action or activity part of the Army, and they were apt to involve few men with perhaps individuals, and they felt the need for an accurate weapon. It was to these troops that these instances that the rifle later proved a valuable arm. These men wanted accuracy, and they practiced marksmanship even with the musket. Washington encouraged such marksmanship since his days with the colonial Virginia militia during the French and Indian War. The smoothbore musket was just not accurate enough, primarily because the bullet fits so loosely in the bore. And the reason being there, the buildup of the residue of the black powder when you fired it was so great that if the bullet was not small enough, then after a few shots, you were going to have a really hard time to ram that bullet down the barrel. So the bullets were made small enough so that the enlisted man could actually fire 30 to 40 times before he actually started feeling that drag on the new bullet you were shoving down in that bore. It had a tendency to bounce from side to side as it shot down the barrel. That's because it was so small. So the nature of the last bounce had a considerable effect on the direction of the flight. That's why there were no sights on these guns. Some people mistake the bayonet lug as a sight, but that was only for to hold the bayonet on the rifle. The limitations and capabilities of the musket have been well described by Colonel John Hager of the British Army, one of the most famous marksmen and authorities on shooting in his day, and he maintained, and I quote, "A soldier's musket, if not exceedingly ill-bored, as many of them were, will strike a figure of a man 80 yards. It may even at 100, but a soldier must be very unfortunate indeed who shall be wounded by a common musket at 150 yards, provided his antagonist aims at him. And as to firing at a man 200 yards with a common musket, well, you may just as well fire at the moon and have the same hopes of hitting your object." It was just such British muskets as these that formed the bulk of the American armament at the beginning of the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812. An American veteran of colonial war still had his British musket, and he took it with him into his enlistment. Magazines and arsenals in the various colonies contained earlier forms of the British arms that were kept there, and they also captured others and used those as well. Americans had grown familiar with the British arms during the colonial period, and the British pattern was natural for them to select for their own military purposes. Like all other states, tinkering with the militia law was an annual event in our Congress. In Tennessee, the legislature recognized many in the frontier society had no adequate means to obtain or purchase uniforms. Officers, upon sufficient testimony as to their financial conditions, were excused from uniform requirements after 1804. Rifle companies were added to militia formations in 1807, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. Each member was reported to report with a good rifle, a shot bag, a powder horn. In 1809, some units were allowed to prescribe their own uniforms, but few did. Nonetheless, it was universally accepted that when all regulations failed, the hunting shirt, as Ron demonstrated for you, was the favorite outer garment, and it was what many of the units throughout the Creek War used, and the War of 1812. The Battle of New Orleans. Various observers and historians have recorded the appearance of the Tennessee militia. One of them said in 1812, who was with Coffey's forces, described them as, quote, not very military in their woolen hunting shirts with slouch hat, a cap made of skins of raccoon or fox, a belt of untanned deerskin in which they stuck their hunting knives and tomahawks, but they were admirable soldiers, remarkable for endurance. Another first-hand account stated, their woolen hunting shirts dark or dingy color, copperas-dyed pantaloons, slouching hats, some composed of skins of raccoons, foxes, untanned deer skins for which they stuck hunting knives and tomahawks, with their long, unkept hair and unshorn faces. When we do these reenactments, very seldom do you see facial hair other than sideburns, which were to come no further than the bottom of the lobe of the ears on U.S. regulars. Many of these militiamen had beards, even though it wasn't the proper thing during the early 1800s. So you have to think about how they looked at that time. A.L. Latour recorded in 1816 that the Tennesseans, on account of their well-known skill at the rifle, were the terror of the British sentinels and advanced posts. Their uniforms, consisting of a brown hunting shirt, rendered it difficult to perceive them among the underwood and dry grasses. And at New Orleans, they were called the dirty shirts by the British because of that brown sort of dirty appearance from a distance. So whether dressed in a refined regulation dress or in a crude hunting shirt, by the early October 1813, the village of Fayetteville was beginning to see more and more troops drift in. Camp Blunt, named in honor of the governor, was formally established October the 4th, 1813. The Battle of Kings Mountain during the Revolutionary War and the Battle of Cowpens in January 1781 were the signature battles in which American rifles made famous their long rifles. And this is where a lot of the legend comes in. And I'll just briefly tell you, Kings Mountain, Patrick Ferguson, who ironically had perfected a wonderful, almost unique breech-loading musket, and was all for the riflemen, ended up being surrounded by local militia, local riflemen, who were taking very good shots at them. They were losing men right and left, so he decided to charge them down the hill, which he did. Well, the militia pulled away and stayed until the charge was spent. They went back up on the hill. The Americans came back, surrounded them again, and kept firing until over 150 some odd British soldiers were dead, including Major Patrick Ferguson. This is the type tactic that was used. And at Cowpens, another significant battle where the riflemen once again proved themselves. But this was due to Daniel Morgan, General Daniel Morgan's intuitiveness. He put the riflemen as skirmishers in front of the British line, who were regulars, hardened soldiers, well-trained. They gave them the order, fire 2 or 3 shots, wait until they get close, and then I want you to run back, well, not run, firing as you retreat, which the British actually admired in the Americans. They were amazed that they could reload as they were going backwards. And that was also due to their hunting procedures. A lot of them did reload while maybe chasing a deer that had missed their shot. So very, very useful. But at Cowpens, these skirmishers were put out. They fired 2 or 3 times, fell back to the Continental left flank, as they were told. They passed through a second line of militia, who then fired again. And these guys were told to fire at the officers, fire at the sergeants, and take aim. Make it careful. They were also laying down in the grass, and when they raised up, because of these types of shirts they had on, they weren't really detectable for a while. Devastated the British line. Those troops then pulled back behind the regulars and hardcore militia who had served in other campaigns, who then fixed bayonets and charged. And it was a hand-to-hand combat. and a great victory for the colonial soldiers and the riflemen. But those are basically two battles out of an entire war where the rifle played such an important part. This happened again at New Orleans, 1815, when many of Jackson's 3,918 troops behind the field fortifications decimated the British troops who charged those works. Not much credit has been given to the United States artillery, who had some 16 guns in those front lines, and they were firing rounds of canister, which is basically a large tin can, 6-pound or 12-pounder, with many numerous iron balls packed in sawdust inside this tin can. It's like a shotgun shell. And they were firing those regularly. A battery of 4 guns can fire continuously. So think about that. After the last gun is fired, your first gun is ready to fire. They had 16 guns on that front line. This played a big part in the decimation of those British troops out front. Some 2,000 plus troops died, and only 13 or so American troops were killed in that engagement. Totally one-sided. Most of it due to the rifle, to a certain extent, definitely the musket, and artillery played a tremendous role. I want to show you just a few things now and talk about the rifle, so I'll grab one here for you. This is a copy of a .50 caliber rifle. The earlier rifles, prior to the War of 1812, were mainly large calibers, 40 to 60, actually. Most of them ranged in the 40 to 50 range. These were the guns that were in all the hands of the Tennesseans, who came from their homes with their own weapons. As Ben mentioned, there were some, how many, Ben? 600 gunsmiths? 400. Some 400 gunsmiths in Tennessee pumping these guns out. They were desperately needed by the men on the frontier, and they used them. They studied the Native American tactics, so they were great as woodsmen, could make long marches. The Battle of New Orleans, troops going from Nashville to Pensacola to New Orleans and back. That's 800 miles at least. I don't know exactly, but a tremendous amount of marching. And these guys lived off the land pretty much. Didn't have to be supplied. This gun fires the same way as the musket of the day, but I'll show you a little bit something else here. Let's put on the old gear here for the rifleman or hunter of that time frame. Pouch box, powder horn, and you notice I'm wearing it high up. You'll learn, as we did in many of our reenactments, that if you go on a long march, you found out real quick why. If you look at the photographs, especially of the Civil War era soldiers, they wear their cartridge boxes and their haversacks up pretty high. That's because on a long march, these things flap, and it wears you out. Also, with this type of powder horn, it was closer to the muzzle. I had to reach back here and do something with it. So in firing this round, the rifleman would put his gun, first of all, at half cock, open up his powder horn, take a smaller measure, this is a cow horn tip, and it has a 60 grain capacity, so you can fill it all the way to the top and not worry about being too full or undercharged. Then that was placed down in the barrel. Then he would reach in his pouch and pull out a small bag containing the size caliber bullet he wanted, Another term, get the lead out. That's where it comes from. Take your lead out, men, we're about to encounter the enemy. Then a small piece of, in this case, ticking was taken out of the pocket. A small knife used, and the guys, sometimes before they went into battle, would take these and cut them, pre-cut them, and either keep it in their mouth to act as a lubricant, or they would pre-grease these and keep them in the pouch itself. They would then place this over the muzzle, take the ball out, place it, push it down in there, the ramrod once again, the whole thing was shoved down, packed one time, then you replaced your ramrod. That was not just a fun thing to do. If you left your ramrod in your gun and fired it by mistake, which many men did in the heat of battle, you couldn't load your gun anymore. So that was one of the steps in loading process that the military had for firing their muskets. Okay, so you're loaded down there. Then you bring up your pan, put a dab on there. The pan is made so you can't overfill it. Close this once again, and then you'll see the spark, I hope, when you pull it back to full cock and fire. That spark hits the flint hits the steel, the spark drops down as the frizzen is thrown forward. It goes into the little pan, burning into the barrel. So there is a slight delay between the time this goes off, which makes a little explosion, and the barrel, but not perceivable really. But that's basically this style. And as you'll notice in the photographs above, these are later period flintlocks from about the 1820s, maybe the early 18 teens, but at least the 1820s. This is a Tennessee gun, which is very recognizable by an iron butt plate, an iron banana type, they call it, patch box. That was another thing. These earlier guns had wooden patch boxes on them that just slid on, and you would keep your greased patch in here. Or you could just actually keep your grease in here, and when you took a patch out, open the box and rub it on that, and then put it into the gun itself. Also, the butts on these guns were straighter in the earlier guns. As I said, this one's probably 1750s or so. It's patterned after that. And they were also thick. If you can look and see, this is about a 3-inch cross-section there. And also, the gun stock is thrown off to the left. To my right, as you can see it. That was made so that, on purpose by the gunsmith, so that when firing, it gives you enough angle to get down on your sights. Because the stock is out, you get more cheek room. And you could also put your cheek to rest on this cheek guard, which is made into the stock. If that was not thrown off or swayed off, then you would have to be a lot closer to the gun to get your sighting. So this way, it's very comfortable. And I'll just run through a few of these. Ben, I'm not sure where the next is on here. The Ford? Let's see. Sorry. I meant to get a button. Oh, okay. Thank you. This gives you an example of the butt that I was talking about, butt plate, how it's very, very slight curve to it, which later became a very indented crescent that fit in your shoulder better. So it was an improvement over these guns. There were also, in 1808, a regiment of U.S. riflemen. These are in winter uniforms. Their summer uniforms were rifle shirts, just like we've shown you earlier, but they were green with a light, almost orange or buff trim on them. They're using the model 1808 half-stock rifle. This was the first rifle made for military use. Had rifling in the barrel. It did not allow for a bayonet to go on it. So, as many of the American officials said, it was a terrible thing to give men only a gun to have to face the British troops who had bayonets, and all they had was a rifle to swing at the enemy. But these were very accurate, and it was the beginning, the first stages, because of the American riflemen, it was the beginning stages of the military branch, which would later become our special forces and would become snipers, and special units. The British also had the same idea. These troops, which were the 95th Regiment, were actually at New Orleans. They didn't play a major role. They couldn't. They were good as flankers or skirmishers, but that battle actually had massed troops, so they weren't used as much. But they are using the Baker rifle, which was an invention of the British, and it also had a bayonet that went along with it. Just a picture of a close-up of the Springfield lock. As you can see right here, it says Springfield on it. There's an eagle with a U.S. underneath. We'll just kind of go through these quickly. Here's a typical battle line of Americans going into battle. You can see the officers trying to keep the men in straight line as they're being fired at. But this is how the War of 1812 was won, with troops in the European fashion. Just a close-up of one of our regulars. These are men of the 7th U.S. In their colors, and they will be with us at Horseshoe Bend. Wonderful reenactment unit. Just to keep giving you some ideas of what some of these regulars look like. Period knapsack of that day, canvas over both shoulders with painted in blue, along with the canteen back then, which was a barrel canteen painted blue. Just a few of the British that were there, including, very interestingly enough, the 5th West Indian Regiment. These were African Americans who fought with the British, and I might mention, too, we don't talk about this much, there were 500 or 700 African Americans that fought with Jackson at New Orleans. We need to go into that. We need to do more research on that and bring this up to the level it needs to be talked about. Kentucky Cavalry. There were a few of these mounted men there at New Orleans. Once again, you can see the type rifle shirt being used. This is an officer. But these men did not have carbines. They were actually carrying one of these muskets as they rode. And if you've ever tried to load one of these while you're riding, it's not fun. It's a very hard thing to do. And then these fellows you'll see outside, this was from our living history days here. And I've gone on too long. But you have a wonderful thing here with this site. You had over 3,000 children that came to see it last year in these fields. We hope that this next year will be just as exciting. And you have a wonderful tourism site in your hands. And we're almost finished with the final appraisals for the 40 acres down along the river. So thanks to one and all. Thanks, Van, and Ben especially. That's it.
We have books for Ben and Fred too, I believe, but we will, in the interest of time, we will hand them their books down here. The next thing on our agenda is lunch, which I'm sure you're all excited about, which we will not pay for. You go get lunch on your own, and then if you are interested, meet us at the Camp Blunt site around 1:30. I think we're going to have a musket firing, possibly a rifle firing, a couple of guys in period costume if you want to take a closer look at that material. If you don't know where the Camp Blunt site is, well, most likely you're sitting on part of it right now, but what is left of the property is right across the street, right behind the Fred's store there, not this Fred, but go right into the back there, and we will be waiting for you there. I would like to talk very briefly about the next event that this War of 1812 Bicentennial Commission is sponsoring, and that is actually a week from today. March 27th is the actual anniversary of the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, which is, of course, why we're doing it this week. But next Saturday on the 29th at 2 o'clock, the Commission will be conducting a ceremony to honor those Tennesseans who fought at Horseshoe Bend in that pivotal battle. So 2 o'clock on the 29th, please plan on being there to join us. We will honor Black, White, and Cherokee Tennesseans who all took part in that pivotal battle in American history, but a very important battle in Tennessee history. We will have our next symposium. We will change up. It will not be in the spring. It will be in the fall of 2015 in West Tennessee, where we will talk about the legacy of this war. Dr. West, do you have anything that you need me to announce or that you want to say?
No, just that come in to Horseshoe Bend National Military Park next Saturday and join us. It's at 2 o'clock.
We certainly appreciate everyone being here. If you have any questions of any of our speakers, grab them in the hall. I'd also like to thank our living history guys, not just Ron Westfall, but Mark Hubbs is here. Mark has an excellent reproduction of a Tennessee rifle out here on the table, which he'll be glad for you to take a look at. But thank you for coming out today. And hope to see you at Camp Blunt.